Hello, good afternoon or good morning or whatever good time it is you're using to watch this. This is the last installment of the lockdown lectures on volume 1 of Marx's Capital for our module on Marx. For this last installment, I wanted to look at a relatively short but very important chapter, which is the chapter 12, the first chapter of the fourth part of the first volume of Capital. The fourth part is one I recommend you to read entirely in your own time. It is relatively straightforward. It's one of the longest sections in the first volume of Capital. In particular, it contains the very, very long chapter on machinery, and that is one of the richest and perhaps most fascinating chapters in volume 1 of Capital. In particular, because it is. When I say it's particularly rich, it is particularly rich in historical and, if you like, empirical material that is, of course, interspersed with theoretical reflections and polemical comments and theological jokes, etc., in the usual manner, but is relatively straightforward to read. There's actually quite often in the first volume of Capital that the parts, so these 7 or in the English version 8 parts of the books of the book begin with a relatively dry and highly condensed and rather abstract chapter that sets out the conceptual framework, and then this is, if you like, complemented by material that is written in a more mixed mode of writing that is partially historical, empirical, and sort of mixed with theoretical reflections, which makes them much easier to read. So that is why my idea was to talk you through only the first chapter, which is relatively short, but quite complicated, and it's one of the crucial chapters in terms of the conception that it is setting out, or the concept that it is setting out. Namely, it is the concept of relative surplus value. Now, you remember from the 4th and 6th chapters that the production and accumulation of surplus value, that is what capital and capitalism are about. Now, Marx introduces here the concept of relative surplus value. Now, if anyone talks about relative this or that, you can bet they have in the back of the mind, or they will introduce in the next moment, also a concept of absolute this or that, and that is indeed the case here. So Marx operates here with a twin concept, a pair of concepts: relative surplus value as distinguished from absolute surplus value. Now, the word relative obviously means that something is looked at under the perspective of its relationship to something else. That something else, in this case, is the working day, or the length of the working day. Absolute surplus value, accordingly, would be a surplus value not looked at in this relationship or in this relativity towards the work there. That is sort of what the words mean. Obviously, the surplus here refers to the value that is produced by the laborer in the working day during the period of one working day, that goes beyond the value that is basically simply covering his wages, if you like, or to be more precise, to cover or to reproduce the value of the labor power of the laborers, which the laborer receives in the manifestation of the wages. So the idea there is, as you remember, part of the working day, the worker works simply to produce his wages, and then there's another part of the working day, which is sort of the time of surplus labor as opposed to the necessary labor. Necessary labor is the labor necessary to produce the value of the labor power of the laborer that is exerted during this period of the working day, whereas the surplus labor is the labor that goes beyond that production period of necessary labor. And surplus value is the value produced in that second part of the working day. And this is the distinction that Marx introduces here at the beginning of chapter 12 in this section here. He uses again a sort of kind of a geographical image, or sort of as an illustration. He says he thinks of the working day as a sort of a line that here on the page you see it goes from A to C. That is, A and C is the beginning and the ending of the working day, and then you have this point B in the middle. B is where basically the necessary labor time ends. So this stretch from A to B is that part of the working day in which the worker produces the equivalent of the value of his own labor power, which then is manifested in the wages and given to the worker. Whereas for the capitalist, the interesting part of the working day is the second part from B to C. That is the surplus labor, the period or the time span in which the surplus labor takes place and produces the surplus value. Now you can, if you look at this, you can maybe think of, if you look at this from the perspective of the capitalist, and you look at this image with this ABC in this line here, you can perhaps think of the B as kind of a switch or a fader or something like this. So the interest of the capitalist would be to shift this B closer to A, to reduce the period in which the worker basically works for himself, if you like so, basically because he produces basically his wages, or the value that is represented by his wages later. And the capitalist obviously wants to increase that second part from B to C, which is the surplus, the period when the surplus labor takes place, and that produces the surplus value. Because the production and appropriation of surplus value, that's what capital is all about. That's what the capitalist is interested in. So that stretch must become bigger. And that is basically, in a nutshell, what Marx is introducing here with the concept of the relative surplus value. So Marx is assuming here that the working day, on average, takes 12 hours, right? So that is in his time apparently a average length of a working day. The portion of AB may be 10 hours, that may be the necessary labor, and then the other 2 hours, that's where really the interesting stuff for the capitalist happens, namely the production of surplus value. So the question is now, how now can the production of surplus value be increased, i.e., how can the surplus labor be prolonged without or independently of any prolongation of the whole length of the working day itself, which is the distance from A to C, the whole thing. If that happens, if the working day itself is extended, say from 12 to 14 hours, that is what Marx would refer to as absolute, the increase of absolute surplus value. That is, of course, something that does happen, and that is one of the strategies capital can use to increase the production of surplus labor, because if the C moves to the right, then also the distance from B to C becomes longer, meaning the amount of surplus value that is produced will be increased. However, there are limits to that for various reasons. One would be that the day simply has a natural limit, so the maximum you can work in one day is 24 hours, right? And you must sooner or later also get some sleep, even under the worst working conditions. And then also, of course, the workers resist the extension of the working day. Maybe they get organized, maybe they have a strong union or whatever, so they have they strengthen their negotiating position somehow, and they put a limit to the extension of the length of the working day itself. And that forces the capitalist to the second strategy, which is the extension of the relative surplus value rather than the expansion of the absolute surplus value, where the length of the working day is expanded. So the length of the working day remains the same, only within that period of time, the 12 hours or whatever it may be on societal average at a particular time in history, in a particular society. Basically the switch, the B thing, has to be pushed to the left, closer to the A, to increase, relatively speaking, the amount of surplus value and the extent of surplus, the amount of surplus labor that is exerted in that working day. So that is what this chapter basically is about, and the whole fourth part of the first volume of Capital is about different strategies that lead to the expansion of relative surplus value, and that is basically what happens in history in capitalist society. So all this is probably the dominant aspect of capitalist history, the attempt, all the different things that can be done, chiefly in the organization and in the technologies of labor that result in the expansion of relative surplus value. That is what capitalism is all about, basically. That is the chief principal motive, and that is discussed in the fourth part of the first volume of Capital, which is why I recommend you to read in your own time, in your own under your own self-management, as it were, beyond only the first chapter, which gives you sort of the skeleton, the conceptual framework of this argument here. So that is the question: how can this relative surplus value be expanded? That is what the fourth part is all about. Now, this is now on these initial pages here. This is now repeated from various angles, as you know already. That's what Marx always does. He kind of comes at things in 3 or 4 different formulations that are all slightly different. So the extension of the surplus labor time, this is the from B to C stretch of the working day, means that at the same time it is necessary to contract the necessary labor time, which is the A to B thing. So obviously if the B, the switch, if you like, is moved towards the A, then the AB section becomes smaller and the BC section becomes larger. That is the aim here, resulting in the prolongation of surplus labor. So there would be an alteration not in the length of the working day as such, but in its division into these 2 parts, AB and BC. So that is the principal idea here. The laborer must work 10 hours a day to replace the value that is represented by his wages, etc., the value of his daily necessary means of subsistence. Given the value of these means of subsistence, the value of his labor power is given. So the value of the labor power derives from the value of the things that are needed to reproduce the labor power. So we had that already repeatedly in the first chapters. That is one of the principal conceptual presuppositions of the entire argument. And given the value of his labor power, the duration of his necessary labor time is given. So what once it is determined what the value of the labor power is, namely by the value of the things that are needed to reproduce the labor power, also that determines the length of the necessary labor time, which is the AB section of the working day. In other words, the length of the AB section, the necessary labor time, depends on the value of all these things that go into the reproduction of the labor power. What are these things? Well, food, clothes, probably one monthly cinema visit, etc., etc. The sort of basket of necessary things one must have to be able every morning to get up and go to work, basically. That is what we're talking about here. So if it is possible, and this is part of the argument here, or a central part of the argument here, if it is possible to lower the value of all these things that go into the basket which determines the value of the labor power of the worker, if it is possible to lower the value of all these things, that would mean that the value of the labor power is lowered, i.e. also the wages are lowered, and the stretch of necessary labor time during the working day is also shortened. Mission accomplished. So that would be one of the principal strategies to achieve the expansion of the BC section, the section of the production of relative surplus value, as opposed to the AB section of the working day, where the necessary surplus, the necessary labor takes place. That's the plan, basically. And the question now is that Marx is discussing is, what are the strategies to achieve the cheapening of the commodities that are needed to reproduce labor power? In other words, that is here on the next page, lowering the wages of the laborer below... okay, so this is now something else. Marx makes now here on this page a sort of an admission that there is also sort of, if you like, a cheaper way of getting there. This is sort of in brackets. This result, however, would be obtained only by lowering the wages of the laborer below the value of his labor power. So basically you could simply try to push the price of labor power below its value. As you know, the difference between the price of something and the value implies that very often, actually most of the time, commodities are exchanged at a price that is either higher or lower than the theoretical societal value of these things. It is only on the societal average, and I will emphasize this at least another 10 times in this chapter, the importance of the idea of averages, societal averages for the entire pattern and mechanism of the capitalist mode of production. It is only on the societal average that all the prices and all the values of all commodities are basically the same. In reality, they might differ, and that depends on strength of negotiating position. So if you are in a strong negotiating position, you might be able to get a higher price for your labor power than actually the value, meaning you have more money than what you absolutely need to reproduce your labor power. If you're not in a strong negotiating position, then you might get less than that, which means the standard of living that you would basically expect in order to get you out of bed in the morning is diminished. So you actually have to get accustomed to a lower standard of living, eating fewer things or less nutritious things, or having fewer cultural or hygienic requirements fulfilled, etc., etc. So the price might be actually lower than the value of the labor power. Now Marx says here, basically in brackets, this is of course something capitalists would try to pull off and probably quite often would also get away with, but this is sort of bracketed out from the discussion here. So this is not what interests Marx. So that is basically in the sort of, if you like, ideal typical conception that Marx is developing here, that is not relevant. That is sort of bracketed out as a sort of as something that is accidental, or that is not really part of the concept of capital. So basically the idea of paying a price that is lower than the value comes pretty close to the idea of theft, basically, because you're not giving the fair price of the fair value of the labor power by paying less. That happens, but it is not part of the concept of the capitalist mode of production for Marx. That's why it is here sort of in brackets. And he says, the surplus labor would, in this case, the kind of the wage suppression, if you like, be prolonged only by an overstepping of its normal limits, normal in the sense of ideal typical. Its domain would be extended only by usurpation of part of the domain of necessary labor time. So basically, part of the time, the stretch of time of the working day where the worker was basically meant to work for himself, to produce his own wages, is taken away and shifted to the other side, to the surplus value, which means that the wages are actually lower than on societal average the value of their labor power should be. Despite the important part which this method plays in actual practice, so capitalists do that quite a lot whenever they can get away with it, obviously, we are excluded from considering it in this place, we, that is Marx himself, by our assumption, because he makes this theoretical presupposition, that all commodities, including labor power, are bought and sold at their full value. So he simply, for methodological reasons, for reasons of the methodology of presentation of his argument, he makes the assumption that no dodgy business is happening. So the labor power is bought by capitalists at value, at the, if you like, fair price. That is the assumption Marx is making here, and I made a note here. This is an assumption that concerns the method of presentation in Capital. So the actual formulation in the German text is here. This method, this kind of dodgy business, is bracketed out by our presupposing that this simply wouldn't happen. So Marx basically says here, and that is methodologically interesting, he looks at capitalism under its sort of best, in its sort of, in its best conceivable practice, not the dodgy capitalist stuff. He looks at the kind of the proper capitalist way of doing things, which includes, which involves paying wages at the full value of the labor power, in theory. So that is, I find that formulation quite interesting for sort of methodological reasons. So now, granted this, etc., we are talking. The only actual strategy that capitalists can use is to cause to diminish the value of the labor power, to act in such a way, or to organize the capitalist mode of production, or to act in such a way that within the capitalist mode of production, the value of labor power itself falls. So given the length of the working day, that is given, that is just fixed, so that has been negotiated, maybe there is a law about the length of the working day, etc., as was the case at some point in the 19th century, the prolongation of the surplus labor must of necessity originate in the curtailment of the necessary labor time. So you must reduce the value of labor power, and thereby you reduce the length of necessary labor time. So that is the first step of the argument here. We are talking about a fall in the value of labor power, which implies that the commodities that are needed to reproduce the labor power of the worker must become cheaper. How do they become cheaper? Through an increase in the productiveness of labor. So labor processes, and in particular then two aspects: labor processes in the sense of the organization of work through ever larger manufacturers and then factories and so on, through the division of labor, how labor is organized, and then machinery. That's the two principal, and machinery obviously involves science, it involves knowledge. Knowledge again is basically a form of organization, so it all comes down to how labor processes are organized in a more scientific and more productive manner. That's how you make stuff cheaper, and that's how you reduce the value of labor power. And that's, by implication then, that's how you increase relative surplus value. That's the argument here. So here he says, hence the conditions of production, i.e. his mode of production and the labor process itself, actually in the German it reads, they have left out here the word therewith, the mode of production, and therewith the labor process itself. So the labor process is not a separate thing from mode of production, but it's one of the aspects of mode of production, must be revolutionized. So that is the language Marx is using here. That might remind you you might feel reminded here of, for example, the Communist Manifesto. So Marx is kind of switching here back occasionally in his language of capitalism being revolutionary. So something that is constantly revolutionizing, obviously, the way we work, but also all kinds of other things that are related to the way we work. So the way society is organized, the way states relate to each other, the entire world history is revolutionized by that dynamic. And at the core of the dynamic is the thrust to expand relative surplus value. That's why this chapter is such a core chapter in the book, because that is the key concept that is sort of, if you want, you could say that's the beating heart of the dynamism of the capitalist mode of production that Marx had referred to already in many of his earlier writings, such as most obviously in the Communist Manifesto, that makes capitalism such a revolutionary thing. And you might remember that Marx is occasionally, and that was obviously the case in some passages of the manifesto, sort of almost a bit ambivalent about capitalism. So he's almost sort of talking himself into a sort of positive, in a sort of enthusiasm about capitalism that you remember through these cheap commodities, and that the cheapness of the commodities is one of the main themes here, the productivity of how labor processes are organized. Capitalism breaks down all these Chinese walls and all the rest of that, all this idea that many of the conservative old regime type of societies all over the world are basically revolutionized. They are brought into motion by this fantastic new thing, the capitalist mode of production, with its miraculous ways of constantly changing everything, constantly being dynamic and constantly on edge. And obviously being constantly on edge, that is also our everyday experience, whether we like it or not. So we are probably much less enthusiastic about that. And Marx is also most of the time less than enthusiastic, but sometimes he switches into this language of capitalism being revolutionary, and here you have a hint of that also in Capital, sort of similar to the manifesto, or there are echoes of this language of capitalism being revolutionary. Oh blimey, what is this now? What the heck is this? Aha, okay. Sorry, excuse my French. So, we are now here at the point, so the labor process must be revolutionized. So this is at the heart of what the fourth part of Volume 1 of Capital is describing, especially this very, very long chapter on the machinery. Exciting stuff. And you can see, at this moment you can see Marx is really enjoying himself, describing the revolutionary dynamic of this new mode of production. And all it implies, all the various implications it has for the totality of society. By the way, when Marx says society, he does not normally mean, which is what modern sociologists usually mean, national society. So society does not necessarily mean country. So society typically means, although that is only implicit, but I think that is pretty clear when you read a lot of Marx's writings, society typically means world society, so the society that the capitalist mode of production organizes, and that is not a country, so that is not a mode of production that is somehow limited to a particular national territory. So by society he really means the societal relations at world level, at the level of the world system, if you like, of the capitalist mode of production, or where the capitalist mode of production prevails. That is what he means by society, and by also by societally average quantities of this or that category. So that is always the perspective here. And that is part of that revolutionary character of the capitalist mode of production. So, by increasing the productiveness of labor, we mean generally an alteration in the labor process of such a kind as to shorten the labor time socially necessary, again the emphasis is on socially necessary, on societal average, for the production of a commodity, and to endow a given quantity of labor with the power of producing a greater quantity of use value. Now this is very important. We are talking here, of course, about the increase of relative surplus value. So that is value as in exchange value. But the way to do that is to increase productivity, and productivity as such is about increasing use values. To produce more stuff, instead of 10 coats, you produce 10,000 coats. Much more use values because they keep people warm. Good thing, basically, in principle, up to a certain point, unless it isn't. That's another part of the dynamic that Marx is describing, the dialectic between use value and the value that constitutes the surplus value that capital is after. So the technical and social conditions of the process, and consequently the very mode of production, must be revolutionized before the productiveness of labor can be increased. By that means alone can the value of labor power be made to sink. Now this is the important thing here. So we have the increase of productivity that produces more use values, and at the same time has the desired effect of reducing the value of labor power. And therewith, obviously, wages, because wages are nothing but the concrete manifestation, the kind of the form of appearance of the value of labor power. And reducing that's basically, from the perspective of the capitalist, the purpose of the whole process. That is probably the strangest and most difficult thing to think, and that's why it's so important. That's why this is such an important step in the argument of the book Capital. This strange contradiction, which is sort of counterintuitive. So you would sort of naively think, well, if productivity rises, and if my labor produces more useful things, then obviously it must be more valuable. But it isn't. The opposite is the case, in the sense of what valuable means in the capitalist mode of production. And that is absolutely crucial. Now, this goes on. The surplus value produced by prolongation of the working day, I call absolute surplus value. Right? Extending the working day from 12 to 14 hours, and thereby adding 2 extra hours of surplus labor, basically to the end of the working day, that is absolute surplus value. So surplus value produced through a technique that simply expands the length of the working day, that's called absolute surplus value, not relative. On the other hand, the surplus value arising from the curtailment of the necessary labor time and from the corresponding alteration in the respective lengths of the 2 components of the working day. You remember the A to B and B to C sections, where the B, like a switch, is moved further towards the A. I call relative surplus value. So that is the definition of the concept that Marx is introducing here. In order to effect a fall in the value of labor power, that's the goal here, the increase in the productiveness of labor must seize upon those branches of industry whose products determine the value of labor power. Obviously, the value of labor power is only reduced if the values and, if you like, the costs of the commodities that the laborer needs to consume to reproduce his or her labor power sink. So making these commodities cheaper, that's the main issue. You could think, for as an example, is kind of probably the most momentous historical example, the Corn Laws, which result in the 20th century in a reduction of the price of corn and bread, food. Why do capitalists support that way? If the price of food falls, the value of labor power falls, which means wages can be lowered. That's why it is in the capitalist interest to have cheaper food, because that reduces the value of labor power and the level of wages. And even if they are perhaps not everywhere at the same time actually lowered, it gives them at least more room to play with, so they can introduce more differentiations between wage levels, giving some groups of workers maybe some extra wages, in other words, a price higher than the value of the labor power, while still being able to pay others the value of their labor power at a much lower level. That's basically the trick. So that is, from the capitalist perspective, the good thing about reducing the price of food. That would be one example of that principle technique. So a fall in the value of labor power is also brought about by an increase in the productiveness of labor and by a corresponding cheapening of commodities in those industries which supply the instruments of labor and the raw material that form the material elements of the constant capital required for producing the necessaries of life. So that's basically a further step back. So if you think about the commodities that the worker needs to consume to reproduce labor power, then they in turn contain value from somebody producing these things, as well as the constant value that goes into these commodities in the form of the raw materials and the instruments of labor, the machineries. Like the example that Marx is using here is if the worker needs a new pair of shoes, then the value or the cost of these shoes will consist of the labor power of the person who made the shoes, as well as the leather, the needles, the machines that are needed to make sure, etc., etc. So you can then obviously go again a further step back. There's almost an infinite regress sort of thing here, because also the machines that the shoemaker will use also are commodities that have been produced by somebody. So there's a kind of infinite a chain of values, all of which allow or become instrumental in the lowering of the value of labor power if they become cheaper. And once labor power becomes cheaper, all these commodities also become cheaper and less valuable. So that is the dynamic, and that is basically that's the name of the game. To increase relative surplus value, you try to push down the values of all these things. I'm not sure what note was that here. Again, at the level of society. So as I said already, that is constantly here. There's constantly a sort of play in the argument, if you read very carefully, between what individuals do, in particular individual capitalists, and what all capitalists together, and basically what all members of society as a sort of fictional unity do. So this lowering of the prices is basically a collective project at the level of society. So all of society basically works towards the cheapening of all things. So the individual capitalist in particular is probably not necessarily even aware of that. So they might be aware of it if they are sort of educated in political economy, but it's not necessary for them to understand these things, because they would do them anyway for motives that are actually quite different from what Marx is describing here, namely motives that have to do with competition. They have to compete with other capitalists, and in that process they do these things, but actually through competition they do something collectively. And that is, of course, a motive that you might know from 17th, 18th century, early modern social theory that this modern type of society that emerges here, that we describe here as the capitalist type of society, is very much based on individuals acting in their egoistic interest, but actually engaging without knowing it and without intending to do so in a sort of collective enterprise that produces this strange revolutionizing dynamic of modern society. That is what Marx is describing here as well. So the totality of the necessaries of life consists, however, of various commodities, each the product of a distinct industry. And the value of each of those commodities enters as a component part into the value of labor power. The total decrease is the sum of all the different curtailments of labor time effected in those various and distinct industries. So basically, if you, as I hinted at before, if you kind of go back further and further in the if you like, in the breaking down of what is actually the value of the labor power, then you will, in the end of the day, you will end up with pretty much all commodities that are produced in society somehow indirectly go into this long chain of quantities of value that finally produce the commodities that the worker needs to consume to reproduce his or her labor power. So the cheapening of all commodities enters ultimately in the cheapening of labor power. That's the idea. That is the idea of the totality that Marx introduces here. Entirely not intentional, probably nobody is aware of this, but we are all doing this in a sense. We are all part of this process within the societal totality. So whenever an individual capitalist cheapens shirts, by no means necessarily aims at reducing the value of labor power. So he has probably no idea that this is what's happening. But this is what is happening. And here is a nice theoretical or methodological comment by Marx, but it is only insofar as he ultimately contributes to this result that he assists in raising the general rate of surplus value, which is of course what capital wants. This is what capital is all about. The general and necessary tendencies of capital must be distinguished from their forms of manifestation. So this is sort of the Marx's argument why we need theory. This is quite interesting here at this place. It is not our intention to consider here the way in which the laws immanent in capitalist production manifest themselves in the movements of individual masses of capital, where they assert themselves as coercive laws of competition and are brought home to the mind and consciousness of the individual capitalist as the directing motives of his operations. So the individual capitalists, they work against each other in competition, that they're competing with each other, trying to offer similar products more cheaply, etc., etc. So they're not aware that they're actually collectively doing something. But this much is clear. A scientific analysis of competition is not possible before we have a conception of the inner nature of capital, just as the apparent motions of the heavenly bodies are not intelligible to any but him or her who is acquainted with their real motions which are not directly perceptible by the senses. That is quite interesting. So he's basically saying that this social science of political economy, or the critique of political economy, is actually in that sense quite similar to the natural sciences, of which astronomy would be the key example. Because we seem to observe, so kind of our everyday experience is the sun rises. Actually, if you study this a little bit, then you know the sun doesn't actually rise. It is something completely different is going on there, which produces the optical effect and our perception of the sun rising. And he says it's exactly like that. So also political economy, which is basically saying a social science in a general sense, operates exactly the same way. So the things that we observe need proper theory that is developed in the manner of theory through abstracting processes and at a conceptual level, although that conceptual level is of course connected to empirical observations and historical study in particular in this case here, but it is the conceptual abstraction that makes us actually understand what really is going on, in the same sense that we understand what really is going on when the sun rises. And actually it doesn't do any such thing at all. So that is a kind of methodological, theoretical sort of thing thrown in by Marx here, as is usual. So you find these kind of comments all over the book. So they are everywhere. Occasionally, when it just comes to his mind, he throws in these little things. Oh, by the way, this is why we need theory. So, and that is that. So now the next thing here, and that is very interesting, another conceptual building block of the theory of the dynamism of capitalism, of the capitalism of production. Now let some one capitalist contrive to double the productiveness of labor and to produce in the working day of 12 hours 24 instead of 12 articles of something, whatever, shirts or tables or whatever that is. So double output. The value of the means of production remaining the same, the value of each article will fall to half because of the, or not to half, so I leave out all the numbers because they are so confusing with all these sixpence and all this stuff. So this 19th century sort of currency thing, so that makes it, for me anyway, extremely laborious to follow the argument. So we have here a reduction in the value of these articles because the value that comes from the labor is actually halved in each of these products. So all the constant value is obviously remains the same. So not the overall value of these products is halved. It is basically 2/3 or whatever it is. But one section, so the part of the value of these products that comes from the labor, that is halved. So despite the doubled productiveness of labor, the day's labor creates, as before, a new value of 6 shillings and no more. So the laborer in this same working day produces exactly the same mass of value. The difference is that now it is spread over twice as many articles or commodities, things, shirts or tables or whatever. So the value of that labor exerted during the length of the working day is spread over many more objects. Only half an hour's instead of whole hour's labor time is now added to the means of production while they are being transformed into each article as in commodity. The individual value of these articles is now below their social value. Now that is important again. The real value, Marx is saying in a moment, well, we can just as well just go on to the text. He's saying here, the real value of a commodity is not its individual value, but its social value. Again, that is the notion of a societal average. So the value of a type of thing is determined at the level of society as a whole, not by the individual producer. However, there is sort of, he introduces here, or he admits here, that there's basically a kind of an individual value which he opposes to the real value, which in that case, because we have this one capitalist who has invented this new production process that doubles productivity, which means that he produces much more stuff. So each individual object, if each piece of the product of that working day contains or represents a much lower value. So individually, these products, these things, are less valuable now. However, at the societal level, because this capitalist hasn't told anyone about his new production process. Nobody else knows. Everybody else is taken aback. They're taken by surprise by this innovation. They are still producing in the old way, more expensive and more value added to these individual objects. Now the societal value, which Marx calls the real value of the commodity, is still the higher value, whereas this one capitalist produces the same stuff more cheaply at a lower value. And so they have an individual, so his commodities have an individual value that is lower than the social value. Now what this capitalist does, he needs to sell his stuff. He's able to sell cheaper than all the other competitors, because they have to realize the value that they have actually, on which they have actually based their production process. So this one guy, he makes a killing because the individual value of his stuff is actually much lower than the real value, which is the value at the level of society, of societal average. Now that is how you make a killing as a capitalist. That's the trick, how the individual capitalist sort of outguns all the others, and thereby creates the dynamism, so the dynamic of the capitalist mode of production, because he forces obviously all the others to catch up. Otherwise they will go out of business. So if therefore the capitalist who applies the new method sells his commodity as at its social value, he sells it for something above its individual value, namely the cost relative to the cost that he's had in producing this, and thus realizes an extra surplus value of 3 pence. On the other hand, the working day of 12 hours is, as regards him, now represented by 24 articles instead of 12. So to realize that value, he also has to sell all these 24 things, which means that the demand for these commodities must be double what it was. And that's of course only possible either by expanding the demand. Maybe this thing is now cheaper and many more people can afford buying it. That's the sort of, that would be sort of the, in a sense, the nice scenario. Or the other case is that he has to take away from the market of his competitors. And that's obviously done by selling more cheaply. So both these scenarios require him to lower the price, obviously. But he can do that because he's also producing more cheaply. So he will therefore sell them, these things, above their individual, but under their social value, at 10 pence each, Marx writes it. So, what was that? You jumped about something here. So that is at the level of the individual capitalist the motivation, basically to outgun the competition. So that is the perspective of the individual capitalist. But from the perspective of, if you like, capital as a whole, of capitalist society as a totality, the motive is basically to produce this dynamism of constantly revolutionizing the methods and the organization of labor. So jumping over little bits here. So hence the capitalist who applies the improved method of production appropriates to surplus labor a greater portion of the working day than the other capitalists in the same trade. So if you think back to this ABC image, the B, the switch, is now moved more closely to the A. That's what this one capitalist does, whereas the others still have the B sort of more to the right, more close to the C. So the section of the working day where they produce the relative surplus value is shorter relative to this one guy with the amazing new production method. So that's the trick. So that's what's basically happening here. On the other hand, however, this extra surplus value vanishes so soon as the new method of production has become general, so everybody else has copied his fantastic new method, unless it is protected by copyright, but obviously copyright can be ignored, or it can be, you can sort of find a way around that. You copy not exactly the method, but something fairly similar, etc., etc. and has consequently caused the difference between the individual value of the cheapened commodity and its social value to vanish. So this difference will vanish, and that's the dynamism. So that's a sort of like a process whereby everything constantly changes, but very quickly comes back to the same point. So one commentator, Marcel, has described this as a treadmill effect. So basically you're running on the spot. So everybody's constantly running and catching up with the newest production methods and the newest ways to organize work. So when I say production methods, I don't just mean technology. I also mean the technology of organizing the labor process itself. So how people, but the division of labor, the spatial organization of labor, etc. All these things are part of that. Everybody's constantly catching up, and everybody needs to be on edge and needs to be on their toes, not to be left behind in the latest developments. But because everybody is forced to do that, basically everybody is running on the spot, because one capitalist maybe breaks out of the field, but everybody else catches up immediately, and they're back to square one. So they're all again in the societal average. So it is again the social value which dominates rather than the individual value of these commodities. So the law of competition forces the competitors to adopt the new method. So that's the thing that happens here. Now, sort of we're coming towards kind of wrapping up and sort of concluding. The value of commodities is in inverse ratio to the productiveness of labor. So that's in one neat little sentence, maybe one of the most mysterious things about the capitalist mode of production. The value of commodities is in inverse ratio to the productiveness of labor. And so too is the value of labor power, because it depends on the values of commodities that are consumed for the reproduction of labor power. Relative surplus value is, on the contrary, directly proportional to that productiveness. So relative surplus value increases with productiveness. And that's why the capitalist is motivated to increase the productiveness, because that's the way to make more surplus value, which in its manifest form is of course known under the name of profit. And profit is the form of appearance of surplus value. It rises with rising and falls with falling productiveness. The value of money being assumed to be constant, an average social working day of 12 hours always produces the same new value, no matter how this sum may be apportioned between surplus value and wages. Surplus value and the value that is needed to cover the value of the labor power, of which wages is the manifestation or the form of appearance. So the value is produced and then apportioned between the necessary and the surplus labor. Hence, there is immanent in capital an inclination and constant tendency to heighten the productiveness of labor in order to cheapen commodities, and by such cheapening to cheapen the laborer himself. That's obviously slightly overflowery language, because it makes the laborer sound like a slave. Obviously the laborer himself is not cheapened, it is the labor power that is being cheapened, to be perfectly precise. But Marx sometimes uses this language with personally I don't like very much, because there is actually a very big difference between being a slave and between a wage laborer. So you have often in the labor movement the rhetoric of the wage slavery, which of course indicates some truth, that the position of wage laborer has some things in common with that of a slave, but still a slave is quite a different sort of situation, and obviously you'd much rather be a wage laborer than a slave. So we're not cheapening the laborer himself, we're cheapening the labor power. That is the precise, or that would be the precise formulation here. So Marx is allowing himself a bit of slack here in this sentence. That happens quite a bit in Capital. This kind of this kind of thing. And I thought it would, on this occasion, quite interesting to look at the footnotes. So many of the footnotes are very much worth studying because they show you how basically Marx develops these things. So you find here, on this occasion, several quotations from 18th and early 19th century classical political economy, and you can see here that Marx is not making this stuff up. So this is not his own thinking. So it's not much of this, with few exceptions, that the concept of labor power, and so that is his own invention or conceptual creation, if you like, and he emphasizes that very clearly, that this is what I came up with. But this stuff here is actually taken from 18th, 19th century political economy, and it's worth reading some of these quotes here. In whatever proportion the expenses of a laborer are diminished, in the same proportion will his wages be diminished, if the restraints of an industry are at the same time taken off. Restraints upon industry, that would mean sort of legal restraints upon wages, etc. So that is from a text from 1753. So this is kind of really early political economy, classical stuff. Says exactly what Marx is developing here. The interest of trade requires that corn and all provisions should be as cheap as possible, for whatever makes them dear must make labor dear also. In all countries where industry is not restrained, the price of provisions must affect the price of labor. This will always be diminished when the necessaries of life grow cheaper. So that is very clearly understood here. Wages are decreased in the same proportion as the powers of production increase. Exactly Marx's argument. Machinery, it is true, cheapens the necessaries of life, but it also cheapens the laborer. So here you have the formulation of cheapening labor. So he took this from here, but obviously that blurs the distinction between slavery and wage labor. So it cheapens the value of labor power. So that is the correct formulation, or would have been the correct formulation. So the shortening of the working day is therefore by no means what is aimed at in capitalist production, when labor is economized by increasing its productiveness. And that is very much our experience, I believe. So we live obviously in a time where productiveness of labor is enormously increasing over the last 100 years. So it's kind of ever more rapidly increasing. But has our working day shortened? Well, to an extent, up to a point. But in the last 50 years actually hasn't. Obviously this argument would need to be made specifically with reference to particular national and other contexts, but I think you would probably agree that as a general tendency, the shortening of the working day certainly has not happened to the same extent that the increase of productivity has happened in recent history. It is only the shortening of the labor time necessary for the production of a definite quantity of commodities that is aimed at. So only the necessary labor time is reduced, but the surplus labor time is increased. And in fact, many of us probably experience in the current period actually a lengthening of the working day. I certainly do, and I suspect many others do as well. So that is, of course, if you think about that historically, totally absurd, because naively you would assume productivity rises, we have to work less, right? But that is not the case, because the increase of productivity is used only to decrease the necessary labor time. But it is actually used as an excuse to increase the relative surplus production. That is basically the main argument here in this chapter. The object of all development of the productiveness of labor within the limits of capitalist production, within that framework, that's what we're talking about, is to shorten that part of the working day during which the workman must labor for his own or her own benefit, to produce wages, or basically the value of labor power, his or her own labor power. And by that very shortening, to lengthen the other part of the day, during which he or she is at liberty to work gratis for the capitalist. That's the production of relative surplus value. And that is that. That is chapter 12. Now I wanted very quickly, so as I said, I recommend strongly to read the entire fourth part of volume 1 of Capital. I want very quickly look at one or two passages at the beginning of part 5. That would be on page 557. It will probably take me a while now to find it actually. Page. That's probably a better way of doing this, but here we are. So this is again in part 5. We have at the beginning a more conceptual short chapter, which is very interesting. I just wanted to point your attention to one or two passages here. This is now which chapter is this actually? Chapter 16. This is the first chapter of part 5. That is after the very long and extremely interesting chapter on machines. The product ceases to be the direct product of the individual and becomes a social product produced in common by a collective labor. So this is the comment Marx is discussing here basically throughout the fourth part and also in the fifth part of volume 1 of Capital, the various strategies that are used to expand relative surplus value. And there are basically two, very to put it very briefly, the organization of labor through division of labor and basically more organized working together, and then through technology, machinery and science and so on. So through these processes, labor becomes a social product produced in common, or the products become products produced in common by a collective laborer. That's an interesting concept here. Again, I wanted to point this out because I mentioned earlier that Marx sort of makes implicitly plays on a dialectic between the actions and the intentions of individual capitalists and basically capitalists or capital as a whole that produces collectively a certain thing of which they are individually probably not even conscious. And the same also applies to everybody else in society. So he introduces here this sort of strange concept of a collective labor, which is basically all laborers that are producing things basically in common, because the division of labor and the organization of labor becomes so complex that basically everybody is somehow involved in the production of everything. So nothing is really produced by just one person or one group of persons, but basically everything is produced by society. And again, I suggest that Marx means by society really world society. So the whole world is basically involved in pretty much every single thing that you produce in modern society. That is an important point here. As the cooperative character of the labor process becomes more and more marked, so as a necessary consequence does our notion of productive labor, and of its agent, the productive laborer, become extended. So that is important because Marx is basically saying here that a productive laborer in this sort of generic sense is basically everybody, not just people who are concretely, perhaps manually, actually produce something, but everybody else. It's also involved in the productive process, because all other members of society somehow do something that, however indirectly, goes into the production of pretty much every single thing that society produces. That's the idea of the collective labor. So there is no point in Marx's conception to distinguish between people who are directly producing something and everybody else who do other things, such as maybe science and teaching, but also banking and circulation and all these things. They're all part of the same overall societal process that produces things. So they're all in that sense, in that sort of generic sense, productive. In order to labor productively, it is no longer necessary for you to do manual work yourself. enough if you are an organ of the collective laborer. Right? So this is almost sort of Durkheimian language here. Sort of an society is almost like an organism here. Obviously that is a metaphor, so he's not actually suggesting that society is an organism. But he uses this kind of, he has no hesitation to use this kind of metaphor here. So you are an organ of the collective laborer. That's quite interesting. And you perform one of its subordinate functions. So all functions are subordinate because they're functions for this collective labor process. And that's in capitalism, right? So that is important. So Marx is here describing capitalist society. So this organism thing is not somehow a utopian vision of peaceful working together. That is actually how capitalism works. So capitalism is this organic thing. So in that sense, you could also say sort of by using that imagery, he perhaps demystifies the rhetoric of organicism that is used by some brands of socialist critics of capitalism, by saying basically capitalism is this thing that you're dreaming of, this organic societal process. And obviously still we're against that. So the fact that it is organic is not a good thing, that is simply descriptive. So on the other hand, however, and that's interesting, our notion of productive labor becomes narrowed. So in the capitalist context, in the perspective of theorizing capitalism, capitalist production is not merely the production of commodities, it is essentially the production of surplus value. So from a capitalist perspective, productive labor is only labor that produces, or insofar as it produces surplus value. So labor looked at under the perspective of producing surplus value, that's productive labor. Labor under the perspective of producing use values is as such not productive labor in a capitalist perspective, because the use values are only, they have to be produced because otherwise the exchange value cannot be realized. So in that sense, capitalist labor always produces use values because it has to. But the goal is to produce surplus value, manifested in the form of profit. So and only what helps do that is actually productive in the capitalist sense of the word. That is important to keep in mind. That labor alone is productive who produces surplus value for the capitalist. And this works for the self-expansion of capital. So this is again an important use of language here. The self-expansion of capital emphasizes how much capital itself almost has this organic quality. So capital is this almost living thing, a process that expands itself, basically using humans, capitalists and laborers, as its instruments. So we are kind of functions within the self-expansion of capital. So Marx sometimes slips into this almost sort of idealistic, almost mystical language. Again, I would like to emphasize that this is a metaphor. So this is not, Marx is not, of course, saying actually that capital is an organic thing that is separate from our activities. He often enough on other occasions emphasizes that it is nothing but our activity. But he uses this imagery for rhetorical effect, but very powerful effect, emphasizing this, the automatic character of the process of the self-expansion of capital. So it is not something we are even conscious of. We don't have to be conscious of it, we do it anyway. And this we do it anyway, that's basically what is meant by talking as if we are simply instruments in the self-expansion of that higher being, capital. So you see there's between the line again this kind of theological playfulness in Marx's rhetoric. So now the next thing is very nice, is perhaps one of the best passages in the entire book. If we may take an example from outside the sphere of production of material objects, a schoolmaster is a productive laborer. think lecturer here, when in addition to belaboring the heads of his scholars, by which he means students, he works like a horse to enrich the school proprietor. So the idea here is that schools are private businesses, as like a British university obviously is. That the latter has laid out his capital in a teaching factory instead of in a sausage factory does not alter the relation. Hence the notion of a productive laborer implies not merely a relation between work and useful effect, between laborer and productive labor, but also a specific social relation of production, a relation that has sprung up historically and stamps the laborer as the direct means of creating surplus value. And now it comes, this is the killer sentence here, one of the most important sentences in all of Marx's writings. To be a productive laborer is therefore not a piece of luck, but a misfortune. That's the sentence. And this is, I think, where I wanted to... Oh no, I've marked some more sentences here. So the prolongation of the working day, well, this is basically, it's just a recap. Why did I highlight this? In order to prolong the surplus labor, the necessary labor is shortened. I think we've been through all this several times now. This is all recap. The production of relative surplus value revolutionizes out and out the technical processes of labor and the composition of society. This is what I wanted to emphasize. So this is another cracker of a sentence here, because it implies that we are here not just talking about, this is not about the economy, this is not just about labor, but Marx is very clearly hinting here, and this is developed in the remainder of the books. So we are here on page 559, so you see there are still 300 more pages coming, or 250 odd pages of text. And this idea here that the revolutionizing, the dynamism of constantly changing the labor processes, that also changes the composition of society. So the entire structure of society changes in this process. And Marx is hinting at that in the remaining 250 or so pages, and also in other works, in particular in Grundrisse, you will find a lot of that kind of thing, where he totally transcends the framework of a discussion of political economy as such, and goes really into social theory in a much more generic sense, in an overriding sort of sense. It therefore presupposes a specific mode, the capitalist mode of production, a mode which, along with its methods, means and conditions, arises and develops itself spontaneously on the foundation afforded by the formal subjection of labor to capital. In the course of this development, the formal subjection is replaced by the real subjection of labor to capital. So I just wanted to squeeze in this concept, again a twin concept, two concepts here. The formal subsumption, or here subjection in this translation, usually this is called the formal subsumption and the real subsumption of labor to capital. Formal means that capital basically takes control of the production process without necessarily changing it very much. That's sort of in the early stages of large-scale manufacturing, where you basically still have sort of artisans just sitting together in larger numbers. It's just a question of magnitude. But what they actually do is pretty much the same thing they used to do traditionally. The real subsumption, as opposed to the formal subsumption, is the process by which capital actually changes the production process, the organization of labor, the labor processes, the technology, with the help of the systematic use of science in the process. And this is what changes the totality of society in the process. So this is basically, if you like, this is sort of the shorthand guide to 19th and 20th century history. So this is what happens in capitalist society. Okay, thank you very much, and I'll see you later in the seminar. Bye. I hope you found that more or less useful.